Welcome to a new topic, crime and punishment. Well, I'm looking forward to teaching this. This should be a good one. And there's a few things that we're going to learn about today. There's 5 different areas I've got on my teeny tiny post-it note, so I remember to tell you all about them. And at any point during the lesson, if you're a little bit stuck, you can always watch this. You can watch it after the lesson. As always, record things that you've found, pause me, rewind me, etc. So the first thing we've got to get our heads around is a sense of chronology, because this is different. With the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans, you were looking in depth at one bit of history, and it was all about why were things happening. In this case, you're looking at 1,000 years of history. So it's not about depth and knowing every little bit and all the little words. It's all about being able to see how things changed and how things stayed the same over this vast period of time. So you have to be aware of the chronology and when things happened, especially because questions will give you certain terms and will mention certain centuries, and you need to know what years they include so that the stuff you've revised matches the things you're going to write in the question. For example, 1785. What century was 1785 in? Now you might be thinking, well, 17th century. If you were, you were wrong. The 1785 is in the 18th century. Now we're going to learn a bit about that today, but I'll give you my explanation why that is now. It's all about before Christ and Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. So every year, we are 2017 years since the accepted date of birth of Jesus Christ. That is how our years work. So the year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, they were all in the first century, the first 100 years after Jesus was born. So those years are all part of that first 100 years. When it gets to the year 101, 102, 103, 104, well, you're then into the second set of 100 years. So the years 100 and something, they're in the second century. And that can be a bit confusing for people. But there's more, because there's 4 key, you would call them epochs of time, E-P-O-C-H. There's 4 of these key periods that we're going to look at in this course. There's the Middle Ages, there's the early modern era, the Industrial Revolution, and then the 20th century, which is obviously the modern era as well. And that's the thing, you see, because they go by lots of different names. For example, you might think the Victorian age, when was that? Well, it fits under the Industrial Revolution. The Middle Ages, you might see referred to as the medieval period. Well, it's the same thing. So we're going to work a little bit on that sort of thing today. You might be thinking, early modern, right? Well, I think that as well. I think that it seems to be quite a bit too far ago for it to be called early modern, but that's what historians call it. Who was around in the early modern period? Well, you're talking the Tudors and the Stuarts and that sort of time. Of course, it's called the early modern period because the country is starting to modernise and starting to look a little bit more like it does to this very day. You've got to get your head around this sense of chronology. What year is in what century, and which of these time periods fits into which year? We'll get our head around that today. But then we've also got to think about what factors affect crime and punishment and change in continuity. So a factor, of course, is something that causes something. And so some things keep things the same for long periods of time. And what's going on in the outside world has a big impact on crime and punishment. For example, now, one of the major crimes is terrorism. You will have heard this on the news. Now, that wasn't a major crime in the Middle Ages. Because the era they were living in there and the era we're living in now means that terrorism is more of a threat, because you've got different circumstances in the world, different things that were going on. Cybercrime is an example of a crime that couldn't have happened before. And all these things are influenced by factors. The key factors we're going to look at: poverty and wealth. So if people are really poor, they're more likely to commit a crime, perhaps, because they might get desperate, they might be hungry. The church has a big influence. And we know for centuries the church had a big say on things. People were a lot more religious in the past than they are now. And the church might have helped to keep things the same for a long period. So that's a factor that kept things continuous. It was a factor for continuity. So it's the same thing. The government, well, that's changed. The government was the king and his advisors at the start, and now it's the Prime Minister, and the Queen has a fairly minor role. So the government over time, they had different things to say. It depends who was in charge, of course, as well. Attitudes in society. And now people might be terrified of terrorism. And maybe rightly so, because we see a lot of things in the news, which is another factor, maybe media. We see things in the news about horrible things happening, so we're a bit scared of terrorism, maybe some of us. However, the amount of people that are affected by terrorism is, in Britain, over the last however many years, is a lot smaller than those who have suffered from, say, serious assault. But the media has influenced that maybe the government takes more action on terrorists than serious assault. So the attitude, and that's because of attitudes in society. It reflects how people feel at the time. Science and technology has a big impact later on in the period, because there's been a lot more scientific and technological advancement in the last 150, 200 years. So that's a bigger impact more recently than a longer time ago. But all of these factors we've got to take into account and start to think about, because you're going to be writing about those centuries, those time periods, and trying to explain how these factors led to change and continuity over time in 3 key areas. So there's 4 time periods, and across those 4 time periods we're going to be assessing 1, the crimes that were taking place. What sort of crimes were people doing? So, I don't know, let's say sheep stealing was a lot more common in the Middle Ages than it is now, perhaps. Cybercrime, we've already mentioned, didn't happen in the Middle Ages, it happens now. So crime is one of the 3 things we're going to look at. 2 is policing. Now, policing doesn't necessarily mean policemen, because there weren't any for a very long time in the bit that we're studying. It means, how did people try to catch criminals or stop criminals? And the 3rd one is punishments. Is the punishment supposed to stop other people from wanting to do that crime? That's a deterrent. Is the punishment supposed to help the person, the criminal, to reform and change their character? Is the punishment supposed to keep them away from society so that they can't influence anything else? They can't be a bad influence on society. So that's another thing we've got to think about today. So yeah, continuity and change. Think of life. Life changes. Circumstances change. I've been a teacher for just about 10 years, and school was different 10 years ago to how it is now. Education has changed. Lives change. You've maybe not been on the planet for that many years to see it, but you've got to trust us as your teachers. The times change, attitudes change, people change, technologies change, governments change, and so therefore crime and punishment changes. But a lot of things stay the same, and we've got to try to work out, it's never just black and white, yes or no. It's never change, continuity. It's always somewhere in the middle. So you're going to be able to decide, is it more change with some continuity, or is it more continuity with some change? It is very, very, very rarely ever just going to be change or continuity. And that is the sort of thing you're going to try to assess today. Okay?